Hi everyone, this is the third video from my series of photo painting techniques. In the first two videos, I was talking about auto painting and tracing techniques. In this video, I will cover the third photo painting method, which I define as smudging. Smudging is very similar to the tracing technique, which I showed in the previous video. But there is a big difference between smudging and tracing. Let me show you this difference in Photoshop example. When I use art history brush in Photoshop, I can paint on new layer by tracing shapes and colors of the original image from the underlying layer. Here I can turn on and off the visibility of underlying layer, and I still can trace the image on new canvas. In addition, I can use a smaller brush and paint out the details of the original image. So it's very easy technique. I call this technique as tracing, and you can check my previous video regarding tracing technique. So that was tracing. The smudging is a bit different. Let's take a mixture brush in Photoshop. From my point of view, it would work pretty much as smudging tool. The main difference from tracing is that it will paint on new empty layer. It will smudge and mix pixels of the original image. But if you turn off the original image and try to paint, nothing happens. That's a big difference from the art history brush. So I would prefer either paint on the original image, but I would duplicate it. So I would paint on not on the background layer, but on the background copy layer. The other difference is that the smudge brush pretty much distorts the image, and it is very hard to paint out the small details unless you zoom in the image a lot and make the brush size very small. For me, this smudging technique is good for kind of bold impressionistic photo painting with large loose brush strokes and less details. And there are a lot of different apps which can do this smudging technique, and I have some of my favorite apps. Most of them are located on iPad as applications, and also it is very convenient to paint on iPad, to smudge on iPad with right on the screen with Apple Pencil. So that's why I prefer using smudging technique on iPad. And let me show which apps I use and how I use them. My first choice for smudging for the painting technique on iPad is Procreate. I'm sure I don't need to make an introduction of Procreate, as it is one of the most popular and must-to-have application for every digital artist. In Procreate, there is a dedicated brush set called Smudge. And that's what we are going to use now. These brushes have beautiful textures and can simulate wonderful brush strokes. Let me take this brush as an example. This is an oil paint brush in Smudge artistic category, and this is one of my favorite brushes for smudging in Procreate. If I add a new empty layer in Procreate and start to paint with smudge brush, nothing happens. This is because smudge brushes in Procreate can only paint on the image itself. So I'll go to layers and delete the empty layer, but I'm going to duplicate the original image layer so I can paint on the duplicated version, not the original, and I can return back to my original anytime. As I mentioned before, smudge brushes are good to paint on the image itself. First, I place large bold strokes on bigger parts of the image, giving the painting a little bit of an impressionistic look. I have brush size on the maximum, and here I paint. You see how wonderfully this brush smudges the pixels of the original image and makes the image as a painting. As usually, I start painting on the background on larger parts just to eliminate the details which we don't need. Then when I need to paint out some details of the image, I usually zoom in the image, then decrease the brush size and paint smaller brush strokes on the smaller details of the image. Like, for example, the face. With the eyes, it's more difficult. You need to decrease the brush size a little bit more. But still, you can do it. The nose. Of course, with the smudge brush, you will not get all the tiny details of the image, but we probably don't need it for this kind of painting because we are going to do a sort of impressionistic style with the impressionistic brush strokes without much of the details. As you can see, I'm leaving some parts of the image untouched because I still want the photograph to show some of the details, but with the brush strokes, the details are not that visible as the original image, as a photograph. And the brush strokes are just wonderful, especially with this brush. Let me speed up the painting so you don't wait for me for a long time. I'm taking away some of the details which I don't need, of this man, etc. I'm smudging and painting at the same time on the image. Okay, that's how my painting would look like at the final stages. Of course, I could spend more time, do the painting more accurately, and just for the showing you an example, I think that's enough. So you've got the idea. We are painting on the image itself, and if we turn off the underlying image, nothing gonna happen. Well, as usual, I have the full tutorial on painting with the smudge brushes in Procreate on my website www.photopaint.com. So please visit it and you'll get this tutorial. Okay, now let's look at another app for smudging technique called PaintStorm Studio. Here I have an image, not a photograph, but an image of Elvis, which I made with AI. And similar to Procreate, I can paint or smudge on the image itself, like this. But there is some difference from Procreate in PaintStorm Studio. I can add a new empty layer, like this, and I can still paint on it. I can paint a new empty layer. But the difference from Procreate smudging and from actually tracing technique is that if I hide the original layer and start painting, nothing happens. So in tracing technique, you'll be able to paint even the original is unchecked, but here I cannot. So I still need to keep the original image visible in order to paint on a new empty layer. That's why I prefer to call this technique smudging, not tracing. Same as in Procreate, I first paint on the larger areas with the larger brush, something like this. PaintStorm Studio is a bit slow sometimes, so you need to close probably the other apps before painting in PaintStorm Studio. We can see the painting strokes on the empty layer when we deactivate the original image. But in order to continue to paint, I need to activate this image, the original image. I have a couple of brushes in PaintStorm Studio which I use for smudging and which I actually published on my website, photopaint.com, together with my tutorial. This brush is called the Rend Texture brush, and it is good for smaller details, for texturing. There is another brush which is called Roller Brush 2, and it's also available on my website, and this gives a bit different results under painting with texture, and it shows actually the texture very well. So I do the underpainting with this brush first, and in some areas just to show the texture. I think I can add a new layer and change the brush back to Rend Texture, and I can paint on a new layer. I can decrease the brush size, same as in Procreate, to paint on the smaller details. And here in this app, the harder I press, the thicker the strokes are. And as you can see, the brush follows the color and the shapes of the image, similar to tracing technique, but again it paints only when the original image layer is active. But it does provide very nice textury brush strokes. With this brush I follow the shapes of the image, and in the end the image or photograph would probably look like more like a painting. Same as in Procreate, I have the entire tutorial on PaintStorm Studio using the smudge brushes here. I was painting portraits, different subjects, and they turned out pretty well. And the next app which I'm using for smudging is called Realistic Paint Studio. This is a beautiful app with really nice brushes. It is perfect for digital artists who paint from scratch by hand, but I found a technique which can do smudge brushing and Realistic Paint Studio as well. So let's open the application. Okay, here is the canvas, and this is the oil paint brushes in Realistic Paint Studio. And what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna paint the photograph. Let me choose the photo. I'm gonna add it from this layer panel, add the reference layer, camera roll, and let me choose this random photo, which I made myself. What I'm gonna do first, I'm gonna zoom in and crop the image to what I want to paint. I probably want to paint these two figures of young ladies. So this is the image I'm going to work on. The same as with PaintStorm Studio, here I can paint not only on the image itself, but on a new layer. Let me just add a new empty layer here. Same as in PaintStorm Studio, I have to keep the original image visible, otherwise the brush will not paint a new layer. In this app, I found that not all the brushes can work as a smudge brush. There are 2 or 3 brushes which can do that, and let me show you. First, I change the palette, check the eyedropper. This is the oil paint set of brushes. This brush usually works very well as smudge brush, and this palette knife also works pretty nicely for smudging. But let me start with this one. You see how nicely it works? I'm painting with a larger brush. It follows the shapes and it follows the colors of the original image. If I turn off the visibility of the original image, you can see that it really paints on the empty layer pretty nicely. But if I start painting without original image visible, nothing happens. It just paints the color of the canvas. Let's turn on the original image and continue painting on the new layer. See that it nicely smudges and mixes the underlying colors, providing very nice brush strokes. As I said, I can use this brush, not brush, but it's a palette knife. And here are the brush strokes it makes. Also pretty nice. Nice texture for underpainting. But let me swap back to this brush and continue to paint with this brush. Let me hide the color panel and continue to paint here. I like it. When I finish with larger parts of the image, I can decrease the brush size. I can actually also add a new layer on top of it and paint the smaller details. It's pretty nice wet, kind of wet brush. I haven't made a tutorial on this app, on this technique in my Photo to Paint website, but this is the first one, the next tutorial on my radar for the full course of how to use this beautiful app and smudging technique. I'm not very precise in this drawing right now, but I can tell you that if I pay more attention and do it more carefully, the result could be much better. I can share with you after that some of my works which I've done with this brush, with this technique, with this app. And it looks really nice. Although you have to be very precise here with painting, with details, in order to get a better result. So this is the final result, which I made previously with the same image. I hope you like it. So this concludes my 3 videos of photo painting techniques: auto painting, tracing, and smudge brushing. I hope you like this, and I encourage you to go to my phototopaint.com website to see all the techniques, all the full tutorials which I made available for you.